Hello, I'm Rob Satloff, the Executive Director of the Washington Institute. My pleasure to welcome you to this special policy forum discussion on the situation in the Hamas-Israel war. This is the latest in a series of events that we're hosting here at the Institute to give you insight and analysis into the situation on the ground and where U.S. policy is fitting in to the important decisions that leaders are taking about this conflict. Before we begin, I wanted to take a moment first to urge that when this event is over and for all the days and weeks that follow, that you take a look at the website of the Washington Institute, www.washingtoninstitute.org, where you can find the latest analysis about this conflict and a broader array of Middle East issues by the scholars and experts of the Institute. Everything that you need to know about this war, about U.S. policy in the Middle East, and about the key issues on the U.S. Middle East agenda, you will find at the website of the Washington Institute. Also, about today's event, if you would like to try to get into the conversation, posing a question for our panelists, there are two ways to do this. If you are joining us on our Zoom link, that you know the routine, please use the Q&A function of your Zoom bar. If you're joining us on some other platform, YouTube, the Institute's online platform, anything else, please send me an email directly. You can address it to rsatloff, RSATLOFF, at washingtoninstitute.org. And I will figure it out and try to get your question into our conversation if we still have time in today's program. We have a lot to cover today because this war looks like it is entering a decisive phase with the end of the humanitarian pause and the heightened military operation in southern Gaza. It looks like there may be a moment of decision approaching in this conflict. To learn about that, to learn about Israel's military strategy, to learn about how the situation is evolving on the battleground, as well as in other potential theaters. And indeed, in recent weeks, the key focus has been on whether the Lebanon theater will become a hot area of conflict. I'm delighted that we have three panelists on today's program. Joining us from Israel is Brigadier General Reserve Assaf Orion. Assaf is the Washington Institute's Rueven International Fellow. We're delighted that he can join us from Israel. He's wearing civilian garb. Assaf is on reserve duty as well in strategic affairs with the Israel Defense Forces. He speaks today solely in his personal capacity, not, of course, representing any governmental institution. He's representing himself and his expertise as a fellow of the Washington Institute. Joining me here in Washington are two of our senior fellows. Sitting on my left is Dr. Matthew Levitt. Matt is the Wexler-Fromer Fellow and the director of our Reinhardt program on counterterrorism and intelligence here at the Washington Institute. Matt, among his many works, Matt has written the standard work, universally recognized as such, on Hamas. I'm delighted that you're with us today. Matt just returned from his own visit to both the Israel's southern border and Israel's northern border, and will offer impressions, among other things, from his firsthand observations. And on my right is the Institute's Friedman Senior Fellow, Hanin Ghaddar. Hanin is the former managing editor of Now Lebanon, the foremost English language media platform in that country. She's been with us for several years now and is the author most recently of Hezbollah Land, a detailed look at the situation within the Shiite community inside Lebanon. And she will offer comments on the key strategic issue on that border which is hot today, which is will there be a military, a diplomatic, or some other solution to the challenge posed by Hezbollah on Israel's northern front? With that, I'm going to turn our program over to our first speaker, Assaf Orion. Assaf.
Well, good evening from Israel. We're today at the 69th day of this war, which began on October 7th. And the fighting, I would say, progresses more or less as could be realistically expected and predicted and planned for this phase. The general purpose is to degrade and eventually defeat Hamas. We understand it will take time. We want to free our hostages. We want to eventually remove Hamas threat on Israel and to end its rule over the Gaza Strip, which is the basis for the threat. Let's say a quick recap of the previous phases. There have been a few days of defensive, clearing up Israeli territory from the Hamas murder squads and death squads entering on October 7th. Then about 3 weeks of fire offensive. Then, since the end of October, and a combined maneuver at the northern part of the Gaza Strip around the city of Gaza. It's a very complicated battlefield chosen by Hamas to be embedded inside urban areas and populated areas. We understand also the significance of the underground tunneling, a very extensive network of about 500 kilometers, 300 miles of tunneling, which Hamas uses for command and control and military purposes. It's on our border, of course. After the beginning of this maneuver, we saw, I would say, the beginning of the current phase. A first humanitarian pause in which 113 hostages were released began at the end of November. And since the beginning of December, the maneuver renewed in the north and also was expanded to the southern part of the strip in Khan Yunis. The goal is to degrade a significant amount of Hamas military capabilities, its brigades in the northern and southern part of the strip, both fighting personnel and arms, including rockets, IEDs, all kinds of weaponry we're seeing there. And most Hamas units which were engaged by the IDF are eroded and are actually operating as their subcomponents, not large frameworks and units, but small units and individual small teams. Not to be a body count, but an indicator. I think it's important to note that the IDF assesses over 7,000 Hamas fighters already killed, quite a few commanders of those units, and a lot of weapons. On the other side, we have still 135 hostages in Gaza, over 800 killed civilians, Israeli civilians, Jews, Arabs, and others, mostly from October 7th, over 400 IDF fatalities, over 300 of them were on the first day. Over 12,000 rockets were launched at Israel, and about 200,000 Israelis are internally displaced from our southern and northern borders. On the Palestinian side, There are over 18,000 dead by Hamas, indiscriminate numbers, like bundled together. They don't differentiate between combatants and civilians. In the West Bank, over 270 Palestinians were killed in the fighting, and in the Gaza Strip, mostly in the southern part of the Gaza Strip, there are over 1.5 million internally displaced persons. We accordingly face a significant challenge in world public view and a diplomatic challenge, as we saw in the General Assembly in the last days. What's next? It's expected and predictable to see the continuation of the current phase within a few weeks. And in parallel, we also see some efforts to reach another hostage release deal, some humanitarian exchange in this sense. And afterwards, I think the future holds additional lower intensity, lower scale operations to complete the goals and the needed achievements. And in parallel, we I think need to expect some encouragement of the emergence of an alternative to Hamas in the Strip. So the war goals will be met over time. Some parts of the operations will take months more. Some parts will take years into the future. A lot depends on our collective capability to prevent rearming and reorganization of Hamas, the stabilization of the Strip, its disarmament, its reconstruction, the emergence of an alternative moderate governance in Hamas, supported by regional and international players. Since this is not just a bilateral conflict, we are actually looking at a multi-front across the region conflict. We are countering terror in the West Bank. We just saw a quite intensive operation in Jenin, northern West Bank. We see daily attacks by Hezbollah. I would say an average 10 attacks per day that Hezbollah conducts as solidarity with Gaza, anti-tank missiles, rocket attacks, and so on, against our forces and civilian communities, which are mostly evacuated. The forces that Hezbollah operates there are, of course, a violation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701. By Hezbollah's count, there are over 100, I think today's count is 104 Hezbollah fighters killed. Israel suffered 10 between soldiers and civilians, and both sides of the border saw their border communities evacuate, fearing the hostilities. We also face some fire from Syria by Palestinian factions, but more importantly from Yemen, which is launching ballistic and cruise missiles, also drones, but more importantly, attacking international shipping in Bab el-Mandeb Straits into the Red Sea mouth. And until now, Israel hasn't responded directly, and we see the initial steps of an international response, but we will see. Beyond all that, of course, the organizing, enabling, inspiring, arming, funding, training stands Iran, and until now they're pretty much unscathed. But this we'll see what the future holds. I'll stop here. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Assaf, for that update. We'll come back with some more detailed questions as we move on into the program. I'll turn now to Matt Levitt.
Thanks, Rob. And it's always a pleasure to be able to be on a panel, Hanin, with you and with Assaf. So as Rob said, I just came back from a trip to Israel, and there are a couple of big takeaways. As someone who deals with these issues all the time, I was surprised at how surprised I was. After even just the first day in Israel, I was really struck with a kind of women are from Venus, men are from Mars kind of parallel, the way Israelis are seeing reality and the way people outside of Israel are seeing reality. For Israelis, every day is October 7th. It is not an exaggeration to say it is Groundhog Day. The hostages, the complete puncture of the Israeli security doctrine, the fact that just days before October 7th, the Netanyahu government of all governments was about to increase the number of Gazans who are allowed to come into Israel to work. There really is just a need to explain to Israelis, I found, why the world is so very focused on the Gaza war, not because Israelis don't appreciate that Palestinians are being killed, but it's war. They would say, we didn't start this war, we didn't want this war. And now, especially in phase 2 of this war, they are doing even more to minimize civilian casualties. That slows down the war fighting for them at a time when they're also being told they have less time to fight the war. The second big takeaway was the extent to which everyone I spoke to at every part of the political spectrum, military, intelligence, policymakers, everybody, that the era of living to a gun to our head, they would say, is over. Not in the South and not in the North. The era of watching as enemies accumulate weapons and we have a policy of keep the calm is over. And a real sense of how, until very recently before I got there, apparently, this war was having a tremendous choking effect on the country. What I mean by just before I got there is that apparently, when I got there, I was a little surprised to see how many people were out and about and in markets and in restaurants, and apparently that's been quite recent. But it's also the choking effect in terms of the maritime issues and the rockets coming in from different types of places. So let me just give a couple of comments on the South, on the North, and then on one other point, and then stop and leave it for Hanin and for the questions and answers. The first is that it's clear that Hamas had a couple of very critical miscalculations. The first is that they did not expect the United States to get involved as we did. I think Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran all are a little concerned that this action might, in the end, bring the United States permanently back to the Middle East at a time when they were quite pleased that it seemed to them we were out and focused on other things. The fact that we have 2 aircraft carrier groups in the Mediterranean, I think the fact that the United States didn't very, very quickly and forcefully kind of force the Israelis to stop and withdraw, I think that was very much part of the Hamas miscalculation. And the second, of course, is that they clearly anticipated, and you can see from their own comments, their displeasure with Hezbollah and others in terms of how little support they got from the Iran threat network and beyond. I think they anticipated, as was the case a couple of years ago, that if they said that this assault, this massacre in the South was done for Al-Aqsa, the Al-Aqsa flood, as they called it, that they would get people in the West Bank to rise up, that they would get Israeli Arabs to rise up. And none of that happened. I think now you're beginning to actually see some perhaps limited disagreements within Hamas leadership between Sinwar and some others as to how far this is going, whether they should continue pushing and completely lose control of Gaza. Ultimately, I think that what Hamas wants is to have within the Palestinian territories the ability to run a Hezbollah type of model where they can participate in whatever government is there, whether it's part of the PLO or otherwise. They can also maintain their own organizational structure and military capability and arms in parallel. That has always been what Israel and the Palestinian Authority have pushed against. And I think Hamas, are hoping that in the post-October 7th world, that's what they will be able to have. Look, there were a lot of people who said that Hamas had matured over the years by virtue of running Gaza, that they cared about their governance project in Gaza, that they were perhaps co-opted by the responsibilities of governance that some of their leaders, even people were saying about Yahya Sinwar himself, that they were militant but pragmatic. And everybody I spoke to across the spectrum, and including people I'd met with before who'd made these arguments, there was no argument. Mea culpa, we were wrong. And that is going to affect how Israel deals with these issues going forward. On the north and on the south, one of the immediate issues is how to deal with the evacuees, how to convince Israelis that it is safe to return to their homes. Now, in the south, of course, it's going to be less of a security issue because there is a war. There's been pushing back of Hamas. There will be some type of security perimeter. But there's more than just a security consideration. There's trauma. I visited Kfar Aza, one of the communities worst hit by the Hamas massacre. There was nothing to go home to, even if people were willing to go back to those homes given the trauma they suffered. In the north, it's slightly different. And I spoke with officials who had just been up to the north, meeting with mayors and regional council heads to get a sense of what would people there need and demand to be able to go back to their homes. And it's very clear to me, and I won't go into more than this because I want to leave it to Hanin, that there is, from the Israeli perspective, a two-stage timeline here. The first is the immediate, what needs to be done to make people feel comfortable to go home. That is doing things that address the threat of the Radwan Hezbollah special forces just across the border, across the blue line. Ideally, they would like Hezbollah to be forced diplomatically to adhere to 1701 and deploy north of the Litani. Short of that, there is a certain number of kilometers that they absolutely will insist that Hezbollah move northward of the border so that Hezbollah is not seen on a daily basis by Israelis just across the border. No Hezbollah flags, no armed Hezbollah guys walking around and shooting laser beams into people's houses, and most importantly, not being able to shoot anti-tank guided missiles into their homes, which, if you do the math, ultimately means somewhere around an 8 to 9 kilometer, 7 to 9 kilometer area where Hezbollah is not actively deployed. The second phase will be ultimately deciding what to do about Hezbollah's precision-guided missiles, which of course can target most of Israel, if not all of Israel, even from fired north of the Litani. This gets into the Israeli perspective of we're done living with a gun to our head. That would be a much, much bigger task and suggests that this conflict will have more of a tail, not necessarily in the weeks and months to come, but perhaps longer than that. The last point I want to make is on Iran, and you've probably seen Iran say many, many times how they don't have anything to do with the activities happening by Iraqi Shia militants or the Houthis or things that are happening in Syria or Lebanon. And there are certain things that the Iranians are clearly doing. Look, the Houthis are firing their rockets. The Israeli Arrow system is knocking down some of them. The U.S. forces have knocked down some of them. Saudi forces have knocked down some of them, which is a commentary of itself. But I think it's important to note that it's the Iranians who are reportedly providing the Houthis both with intelligence about which ships have partial Israeli ownership, which is not necessarily something you can quickly find on your own, and also where they are located. But Iran is doing other things in the context of this conflict while the world is focused on Gaza and on Lebanon. For example, doing some things that are not so great on the nuclear file. And what was a surprise to me, reportedly making significant strides on not only developing, but there's concern about providing to allies some of their new chemical weapons, which would be a significant threat. So let me stop there and we'll open up to questions and answers. Again, it's a pleasure to be able to do this, Rob, with you and Hanin and Assaf. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Matt. I'm going to turn to Hanin in a moment. Just want to remind everyone, if you want to get into this conversation, either use the chat function on use the Q&A function on your Zoom bar, or send me an email directly at rsatloff@washingtoninstitute.org. Turn now to Hanin Ghaddar. Hanin.
Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you, Matt, Assaf, for your comments. Very happy to be here to talk about an unhappy topic. This is like to look at the Lebanese border from Lebanon's perspective and international perspective. We're looking here at three main options, right? So it's like the military options, which is after Gaza war, there will be a war with Hezbollah, a similar war or a different kind of war, more targeted attacks. But this war would take us to option 2, which would be a more regional war where Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies will be involved. And we're seeing today like Houthis and other Iraqi militias targeting American and Israeli interests, but this might develop into more of a Hezbollah-Israel war and a regional war. These are the military options. What we're looking at today, if you're looking at diplomatic options, the international diplomatic options, we're basically looking at efforts to implement 1701. This is what everybody's focused on, to implement 1701. 1701 is, on paper, a very good resolution in the sense that if Hezbollah really withdraws to north of Litani, that's great. That's what Israel wants. Well, that would be really good for border security. But that's on paper, because we've tried 1701 and it didn't work. And 1701 didn't work for many reasons, but I think mainly because it was isolated as from the other Hezbollah issues. It was looked at as a border security issues, without looking at Hezbollah security risks beyond the border security issues, security risks. There will always be a Hezbollah problem. I'll talk more about this later. But I think today, the real deterrence for Hezbollah today is not just implementing 1701 and implementing it properly, because implementing it the way we did in 2006, it's not going to work. Implementing it properly requires a broader policy that would involve, one, making sure that there is a success in the Gaza war. Israel needs to succeed in the Gaza war in order to send a message to Hezbollah. Hezbollah is today looking at Gaza and seeing if Hamas gets away with it, even if it comes out weaker, it will rebuild and restock. Hezbollah is looking at this war and seeing, will Hamas get away with this? Will they emerge stronger, the same, or weaker? Will they lose or will they win? How they will spin this into a victory? All the answers to these questions will determine Hezbollah's next steps. So it's very, very important that Hezbollah understands that Hamas will not get away with it and that they will not get away with it if they do something similar. Probably they're not going to do the same thing that Hamas did immediately. This is not like an immediate risk, but it is a risk nonetheless. We see today that when Hassan Nasrallah said in his latest speech that Hezbollah will only act if Hamas is at risk of losing or is Hamas in trouble. I think he means the opposite. And if you see since then, all Hezbollah's recent statements, like yesterday, Naim Qasim said something about quote unquote, border attacks will not stop before Gaza war ends. This sounds like a threat, right? So we will not stop before the Gaza war ends. But if you look at it, really, it says that we will stop when the Gaza war ends, because they don't want to do anything right now. They're actually relying on the diplomatic efforts to stop Israel also from launching a war on them. They don't want Israel to come to them immediately afterwards. So the message from Hezbollah today is, we don't want to start a war now. Our border escalation is really calculated. We're not really going into a war with Israel. This is just to support Hamas. Please understand, keep the deterrence. They do understand that the deterrence is no longer the same, but they want to make sure that Israel doesn't come to them afterwards. And depending on what happens in Gaza. But they also know that this is a temporary solution so they can buy time, which is a game that Hezbollah and Iran plays very well. They buy the time, they play on the time, they get ready, they ready their military fighting force, they get the budget for the war, they get guarantees for reconstruction. They need all that in order to go for a war. And they want to get ready before they do this. And this is all temporary, and their game has always been, since 2006, with implementation of 1701 or not, they can easily hide the risks. So the risk will always be there, but it might be visible or invisible risk. They might send reassurances by keeping the risk invisible, but it's always going to be there. So that's why it's very important, if we want to implement 1701 and do border demarcation with Lebanon, and if you want to look at this problem as a border security issue, it cannot be isolated from the broader framing of Iran's regional problem. Iran's proxies. This is very important. You cannot isolate 1701 and the border security issue without really linking it with the proxies in the region, because we're seeing today how all these proxies are linked. It's true Hezbollah has not entered a war with alongside Hamas as a united front, but the proxy problem is still there. The Houthis, others, anyone can move at any moment. So it's very important to have a successful implementation of 1701 is to address the Iran regional problem without really weakening Iran in the region. If Hezbollah and other Iran proxies continue to grow stronger in Lebanon and the region, we will always have a security risk to Israel and the West, and there will always be a border security issue. That's why today it's very important to link 1701 to Iran regional problem. Otherwise, because in 2006, it didn't work because we tried it. It didn't work because it was isolated. Everybody was saying Hezbollah is an internal Lebanese problem. Let's only look at the border. And that's why it didn't work, because Hezbollah grew stronger and stronger in Lebanon and the region since then, and continued to be a security issue and continues to take over the decisions. We've tried it. Also, who's going to monitor Hezbollah south of Litani to make sure that they're not an invisible risk, if not visible? UNIFIL, we tried it. LAF, depends who in the LAF, but we also know, like LAF is strong in certain areas, but not when it comes to Hezbollah. And Hezbollah can always play the plausible deniability game. Even if they say we're not south of Litani, they can always send some of their factions, which is the new Hamas, Tala'a Tawafan al-Aqsa, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin in Lebanon. Since 2002, they have become much closer to Hezbollah and Hamas. The Palestinian decision today is in Hezbollah's hands after earlier this year war in Ain al-Hilwi. They took over the Palestinian decisions. They can easily play the plausible deniability game and have some kind of indirect presence south of Litani. It's a completely different issue. And they have Saraya al-Muqawama. They have so many. I can go into like all the details of all the factions that they control, but I'm not going to do that now. That's why it's very important to frame the 1701 and border security issue as Iran regional issue, Iran-Lebanon internal issue, use all the tools to weaken Iran's grip in the Lebanon region, and make sure that Hamas does not succeed to survive in Gaza. I can go into more details, but I think I've used my 10 minutes. So I'll stop here.
All right, terrific. Thank you very much. All right, so we have quite a lot on the agenda. There is one additional item that I thought that I would just make a brief comment on, and that is the sort of headline news the last 24, 48 hours about President Biden's comments regarding the conduct of the war, the Israeli cabinet, the Prime Minister Netanyahu, et cetera, the front page stories about President Biden critiquing Israel, and does this suggest the first substantial breach between the United States and Israel in this conflict? I think it's really important for people to take a look at the entire statement that President Biden delivered, which was released by the White House. This is not a hidden story. This is not someone at a fundraiser with a cell phone in their pocket, surreptitiously taping the president. The White House released the president's entire statement. You have to read the entire statement. What is remarkable about this, from my perspective, 2+ months into this conflict, is the deep and abiding support that President Biden still has for what is essentially, in his view, the just war that Israel is waging against Hamas. The president spoke in no uncertain terms, but he used terms which is going to cause him a little bit of heartburn in some parts of the American political establishment, twice referring to Hamas fighters as animals, totally validating Israel's war aims. What he did do is critique the composition of this Israeli government and the difficulty that that he sees Netanyahu having in making certain decisions, especially about post-war situation in Gaza, if he maintains certain members of this government. A, I think that's analytically accurate, and B, it's a response to what I think was a rather unfortunate public display of disagreement that that the Prime Minister of Israel took with the president. Something that in wartime these sorts of differences should really remain private, especially since Israel relies upon the presidential finger in the dike, as it were, to hold back what is becoming a global tidal wave of support for a position that neither Washington nor Jerusalem thinks is wise, which is the imposition of a ceasefire. Both of them understand why that would only leave Hamas in power and would be not just a failure in a military sense, but it would prevent and undermine any conceivable post-war diplomacy. We're all talking about, there's so many different initiatives out there talking about what happens after the war. The Prime Minister has made comments, the President's made comments, we've made comments here at the Washington Institute. But ultimately, it all depends on what Israel is able to accomplish in the fighting. And here, the basic dichotomy is a war that ends with Hamas intact and even a weakened, battered Hamas still able to wave a flag that they've survived means one thing, and that means no diplomacy, no diplomatic path, no political context for after this fighting, a war that ends without Hamas being able to claim that it has survived in an organizational, territorially controlling way in Gaza means something else. It means a lesson to Hezbollah, as you suggested, and it also means the opening of opportunities, how we take advantage of them. There's a lot of diplomacy that needs to happen, but that is really the key determinant of whether there is a diplomatic path after this war. And I would hope that the United States and Israel would maintain their differences in quiet about this. That's what wartime allies do. With that, we're going to turn to questions. I've received quite a few questions online, both in the Q&A function and directly on email. Let me begin with you, Assaf, which is you gave a very good overview. Could you go another step further and give a bit of, put on your independent analyst hat and give a bit of analysis about what Israel has achieved and about what Israel hasn't achieved 2 plus months into this fighting?
I think the most important thing to understand and to manage is the tension, the central tension here, is between people's expectations and the war goals. The war goals of removing the threat from Gaza by destroying its military and governance capabilities are ambitious. We understand that both operationally and strategically, they're very demanding. Now, in Israel's concept, the war is by definition a long war, unlike any other that we waged before, except the War of Independence in 1948. And the world expectation and Israelis' expectations are calibrated along our other wars. You know, Yom Kippur 73, 50 years ago, was about 3 weeks. The longest conflict in Gaza was 55 days. So we're mostly judging the achievements with a stopwatch in our hands. Now, as I described, that the intensive phase is about to finish in a few weeks, many people will think, well, the war is over. Are we there yet? The war is not over. An intensive phase of that war is over, but in fact, the right way to look at it is a long-term, I would say, a grand campaign, in which the high-intensity phase is just one, and then there will be other phases into the horizon. A second point to make is that, as Clausewitz said, war is the continuation of politics in other means, or by other means. And we need to understand here the connections to Israel's domestic politics, because after October 7th, everything was, is under the title of not until the war ends. We will deal with that after the war. And there are many pending issues from accountability of the political level and inquiries and perhaps coming to terms with the current government, and the question of this situation in which the war cabinet actually relies on opposition members like Generals Gantz and Eisenkot. So on one hand, politically, there is an interest of having an endless war, so there will not be the day after. But strategically, there needs to be a long war, well-planned, well-executed, since a long war is not only about punch, it's about breadth and perseverance and economy and strategic allies and so on and so forth. Much like what we saw in World War II. It's a different test of capabilities. So I think time is a very important dimension, thinking about this war and understanding how to set the expectations right as concerning the achievements and the war goals.
So I received quite a few questions from viewers who want to know the future. In various aspects. How long will the war cabinet survive? What comes after the war? Who replaces Hamas? Lots of different aspects of the future. Now, obviously, this is not so easy to analyze the future. Although, as my professors used to say, you have fewer footnotes when you do that. But what I'd like to ask you, Matt, from your discussions in Israel, not about any of the specifics, but more generally, how are Israelis thinking about this? Are they even thinking about the future? Or are they thinking about dealing with their current reality?
Okay, so don't think that I won't forget when it came to asking the impossible question that you threw me under the bus. I will not soon forget that. Thank you for the question. Look, I was struck by how fixated Israelis are on the moment. When I was speaking with people in the military and in the security establishment, that was very understandable. They're prosecuting a war. They're very focused on the here and now. When I spoke to more senior level people, the conversation went, and it only went this way when I brought it up, about, well, what comes next? And there was tremendous discomfort there because ultimately I wasn't speaking to politicians, and this is a political question. When I pressed them, they shared with me their frustration and their understanding that in order to be able to expect that the West is going to continue to support Israel to the extent that it is, they're going to need to be able to articulate towards what end and give us confidence that they have an idea such that we don't end up by default with another Hamas or this Hamas. And that is just part of their political situation. Netanyahu does not have any interest in saying, look, I ran in a campaign that said only I can protect you. I was wrong. I'm going to step down. Remember, Golda Meir won an election and it took her several months to step down herself. But he's got legal cases and other things There's no incentive for him to step down now. Some people I spoke to talk about an effort for him to be removed internally within the Likud and for Likud to negotiate a deal by which he's not prosecuted. I find that to be hopeful and not very likely. But at the end of the day, there is this disconnect right now between the politicians who are running the government and the generals who are running the war, even as both sides recognize that there's a Venn diagram overlap there that really needs to be addressed.
So on this, let me ask you, Assaf, a piece of this. I mean, you just explained in your answer to your previous question that you expect a long war, but of a different type of military operation than the one we're seeing currently. However one defines long, it's more than a few weeks is what you have in mind. Many people will view the period after the conclusion of the current phase of military operations as the moment when diplomacy should begin to engage, as the moment when other actors should begin to get involved in reconstruction, repair, whether other actors get involved in new types of humanitarian efforts in Gaza. Is that what the planners are thinking, or is what you're saying that it's envisioned that there will be a longer period where Israel actually remains the major external player in Gaza, and other actors, it's not ready yet for diplomacy? Is that what you're suggesting?
In Hanin's words, there were alternatives between military and diplomacy, like a dichotomy thing. In your words, it's a serial, military phase, then diplomatic phase. My professional training says they are more parallel and complementary than a dichotomy. So the military operations provide pressure and context and a starting point and impetus, energy, and the diplomacy many times provides a ramp out. Now, we will need to see this combination of degrading Hamas and stabilizing Gaza. Israel doesn't have any presumption to stabilize Gaza. It is very interested in showing what emerges in Gaza, like that it doesn't rearm, or so, Hamas can be contained until defeated in a smaller threat profile. But we are all hearing that the expectation of the reconstruction and the rehabilitation of population and so on is not something that Israel picks the bill for. So I think we need to understand that this is happening in parallel, even as we speak in an intensive phase. You see efforts of humanitarian, which are based on diplomatic efforts, and I think it's pretty much combined.
Okay, thank you. Hanin, a couple of questions on the Hezbollah Lebanon challenge. First, I know we've addressed this in previous events, but it's good to underscore it again. Is when we think about this challenge, is Hezbollah an independent actor, or is Iran calling the shots? And then secondly, how do you evaluate the actual discussions about 1701 that are going on right now? I know you critiqued some of this, but when you hear American officials and European officials talking about this, what's the key missing ingredient for them?
Okay, so briefly, on the first questions, Hezbollah really is not even a proxy of Iran. I know Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, has said it many times that he himself and his party are soldiers in the IRGC, in Wilayat al-Faqih's army. We gotta believe him when he says that. Hezbollah is Iran's part of Iran's Quds force. It's more than a proxy. It's definitely beyond a proxy. It's only space for, I wouldn't call it independence, but work without having to go to Iran on every single detail is the domestic Lebanese politics, because they understand it better. But on war and peace decisions, regional operations, big security and military decisions, it's the IRGC call the shots. It's definitely not Hezbollah, especially that they do not have today the Imad Baghniyi commander and even the Mustafa Badruddin, and they have people who are not 100% trusted by the Iranians as they used to trust Imad Baghniyi, for example. And I think what is a good sign of this today is the fact that all the meetings between Hamas and Hezbollah since earlier this year until today have always been attended by an Iranian IRGC guy, but also the guy who's playing the Qasem Soleimani role today is not really Khani, it's Abdullahian. He's like really leading the not just the diplomatic efforts of Iran, but also the military efforts in the region. He's the one doing the regional tours, and it's always been like that. On the second question, the 1701, what really is missing is the sustainability element. If we always know that everyone is looking at today issue between Hezbollah and Israel as a border security issue that we want to manage until the next big thing, because they will infiltrate, the risk will be invisible, and they will always use other factions under the plausible deniability claims, and they will always find a way to violate 1701 like they've done before, eventually, maybe not immediately. So sustainability is really the case. It's like there's a difference between managing the risk and resolving the risk. And what we're doing here is managing the risk for a while until we figure it out. And really resolving the risk, as I said before, requires looking at that problem, the border security problem, as Iran's regional problem, not just as a temporary Hezbollah problem.
Matt, is there something about the Hezbollah challenge you want to add?
I just want to double down on what Hanin just said. You know, all the Israelis I spoke to made it clear that for a long time, this was regarded, both the South and the North, as a conflict management issue. Not because they liked it, but for lack of better opportunities. They realized sending in the IDF into Gaza, starting a war with Hezbollah would be very, very costly, very, very complicated. Well, their hand now has been forced. And the era of conflict management is over. And hopefully, because Hezbollah sees what the IDF has been forced to do in the South, and that they're serious about it, that if they need to level neighborhoods, they will, that if they have to enter a hospital, they will, that Hezbollah understands that they're not bluffing, and that contributes to the diplomatic leverage. And maybe Hezbollah, because it doesn't want to lose a significant amount of its rockets, et cetera, maybe it does decide to redeploy somehow. But that ultimately, this now is going to have to be resolved. The South right now, the North in the immediate regarding that, 7 to 9 kilometers, but not just that. And ultimately, this means that this is a turning point in the region. And I think people need to understand that the Israelis are very, very serious about it. And when people assume that Israel would be willing to do a ceasefire right now and just go back to this conflict management, that the war, the high intensity war, and then maybe even the long war that follows can run its course and then end, and Israel will go back to just knowing that there are precision guided missiles aimed south at it from Lebanon and be okay with that. That's over. And that means that the region is going to be run differently looking forward.
So we've been focused on the potential for escalation on the north. We've actually seen escalation in another arena, and I want to ask Assaf about this, and that's both cruise and ballistic missiles coming from the Houthis in Yemen. Now, thankfully, they've been intercepted, whether by Israelis, Americans, even Saudis, but the fact remains that they're being launched. what is Israel's response to this, other than trying to defend against it? Will Israel have a different type of response before long?
Right now, I think it's very evident that Israel is focusing on the Gaza front and doesn't lend itself to diversions wherever they come from. But over time, it's beyond those missiles that you mentioned. I would say disruption of the freedom of navigation, international shipping. This is a very busy shipping lane area, a strategic choke point on the world trade. Today, I think a ship under a Chinese or Hong Kong flag was targeted. There was a decline in the Suez Canal income for Egypt. There will be rising costs of insurance and other elements for the world economy, certainly for Israel needing to go around Africa if we go this way. And it's all enabled, all the weapon systems that you mentioned are, of course, made in Iran or developed in Iran, and the industries were lended to the Houthis. So we understand it's, as Hanin said, it's a systemic problem created by Iran. It's a world global commons question. And I think it's very becoming that the US is galvanizing this task force 153 with multiple nations to try to address it. It's not just an Israel problem.
Okay, thank you. Matt, a question for you that came in. It's triggered by the fact that you were able to go yourself, go to Gaza, see firsthand the horrors from October 7th. But the war is being fought in Gaza, but more broadly, it's being fought on social media, being fought on TV, et cetera. And on those platforms, Israel is losing. Whatever, or much of the sympathy that Israel had in the early days after October 7th has been replaced quite logically by now 2 months of the imagery of the horrors of the fighting in Gaza. Did you get a sense that Israelis recognize this shift? Do you have an understanding of what their strategy may be to fight that battlefield differently as time progresses?
Yeah, absolutely. I raised this in multiple meetings, and they're very, very aware. There are certain constraints that they have. Social media runs at a very, very fast pace, and people want information immediately, but the Israelis are typically constrained by operational considerations. They don't want to release information immediately if they still have operatives on the ground someplace, et cetera. You had the classic situation with the Hamas tunnels under the hospital. And there were a couple of days where people were saying, you said you'd find all these things and you haven't. And then when they were able to show that they found pretty much exactly what they said they would find, there'd already been these 2 days. Israelis are very cognizant of this, and it's never been their strong suit. They're much, much more focused on winning the actual war. And leaving the battle of ideas to the diplomats, et cetera. And that's of secondary importance to them. When you're fighting an existential war, your focus is on winning that war. And if there are people who don't understand that, you'll do the best you can, but ultimately they can't stop the images coming out of Gaza. They're horrible images. We should all feel tremendous pain and discomfort about these images. But the bottom line is wars are horrific, and this is not a war Israel started or wanted. And when there are people out there who are saying that the suffering in this war is worse than other wars, they're just not paying attention to other wars, in particular the war in Syria, just to point to the most recent. Every Israeli I spoke to was really broken about the loss of Palestinian lives. I met not a single Israeli who celebrated it, was comfortable with it, but they just kept coming back to Hamas specifically hides itself behind these people, does everything in its power to put people at risk. There's only so much we can do to try and fight this war while protecting civilians. They're doing things that put their own soldiers more at risk. And if they can't convince the world of that, that's going to have to be a secondary issue. It's a little bit of a conundrum, but I'll be honest. That's one of the reasons I went. I felt the need to borrow a term we haven't used since the Holocaust, to bear witness. And it was because I met someone that I used to work with in government here in the United States who insisted on a conspiracy theory that the Israelis Hamas couldn't possibly have carried out the attack at Re'im with the music festival because they don't have weapons enough for that. Surely it was Israeli helicopters. This wasn't some fool. This was a PhD economist who used to work with me in government. And so I felt the need to bear witness and to be able to see it from my own eyes. And that's something that will, that conversation and battle in the public spaces will continue. For the Israelis, the most important thing is protecting their civilians and rebuilding a new understanding between the government and the public about how the government protects its civilians, because that in the moment has been shattered.
Thank you. Assaf, I have a lot of questions asking if you can help disentangle a little bit more what the Israeli operational strategy is in South Gaza, in the sense that it's a smaller area than when we started. It's more densely populated because of internal displacements. The presumption is that this is where Hamas leaders, the main names that we now know of, Sinwar, Deif, are located. It's also the place where one assumes the remaining hostages are being held. Israel has begun to pump in seawater, fresh water, different places into tunnels. How do you disentangle the various objectives here? And where do the objectives of getting the leaders and freeing the hostages? How do you disentangle these horrific competing priorities?
Well, it's a wicked problem set. Nobody promised us it would be simple. A lot of tough choices. In some places, you say, okay, I stole the operations. For instance, the humanitarian pause of the end of November. It allowed Hamas to reorganize. They're much better now ready than they used to be, in the disarray of our constant initial pressure. It cost us when we resumed fighting. In some places, you abort operations because you don't want to risk your hostages. In some places, in one case, we went in and managed to free one of our hostages alive. In the last week or two, we saw reports on one attempt that ended badly, without success, and with two of our special forces badly injured, but no live hostages back. In another, we lost soldiers trying to retrieve more information, items, and bodies. So we have now, among the 135 hostages, about 20 are believed to be dead, at least. Hamas is murdering them as we speak, or letting them die. Not all of them are healthy. Some of them are elders, and so on. And you should hear the testimonies of the witnesses coming back from this captivity. There was an interesting statement by one of our seniors saying that if we get to a moment when we know where Sinwar is and he's shielded behind hostages, it will be a heartbreaking decision. He didn't say it will be a tough decision. Now, heartbreaking means that, well, that's one of the options that can be decided. I won't be a prophet on this. I'm happy that I don't need to make the calls, but it's a very intricate, difficult, saving your own by keeping them alive and trying to negotiate their freedom or free them by force, and at the same time fighting a vicious terror organization, barbaric in its methods, and still manage it. It's a very tough balancing act. I don't have a simple answer.
Okay, very good. Thank you. All right, we're coming to the close of our time together. So just brief questions for each of our panelists, really about timing. This is, I think, our fifth policy forum looking at this conflict since we began. Can each of you, in your own sense, I know that's very difficult, give us a sense of timing? How long do you anticipate this current phase to go on for Assaf? How long do you think before there will be a sense among Israelis that they can begin to at least think about returning to their homes, as you pointed out, Matt? And how long do you think they're going to sustain this narrow conflict just along the border before there's either some diplomacy that helps resolve it, or even worse, regrettably, some major escalation? Okay. Assaf?
My guess, several weeks at least. It will be a good thing to have another forum, I would say late January.
Several weeks. Okay. Matt?
Yeah, I agree. I've heard some Americans express hope that this could end by the end of the year, and I've heard many Israelis say the end of January is more realistic for this high-intensity fighting that Assaf discussed. Nothing really can happen returning the evacuees until that phase is over, probably a couple of weeks after. In terms of people returning to the north of Israel, where their homes are still standing and there isn't the same kind of trauma, assuming that there is an understanding, an informal understanding with Hezbollah, and there are very, very clear communication channels ongoing already about where Hezbollah is and isn't along the blue line. And Israel will have some comfort with that because of the level of the force that they will have deployed there. In the south, there's just the additional issue of rebuilding. People, across the street from Kfar Aza, where I visited, which was decimated, there's Kibbutz Saad, which was kind of miraculously unscathed. Will people feel comfortable going back into those homes? That is as much a personal, emotional decision as it is a security one. And that I don't know the answer to, but they're going to want people to be able to get out of these hotels and shelters that they're in and get their lives back, because they're living moment to moment, not real lives in the moment.
And so based on Matt's comment, will perhaps by mid-February there be some understanding?
Yeah, they made it very clear between Naim Qassem and other officials this week that they will stop the attacks when the war is over. So it sounded like threat, but it's not really. It's more of a reassurance saying like, we'll stop when this is over. But that doesn't mean like this phase for Hezbollah where it stopped. They don't want the war now, and they made it very clear that they don't want to be involved in the war now. However, they need the time afterwards in order to get ready for the next war, because they know that for the Israelis, the post-2006 deterrence living with Hezbollah across the border, even if there is some kind of a buffer zone or 1701 implemented, their risk will always be there. And they know that the next confrontation is coming, and they will use the time between end of January or mid-February until the next Haida to get really ready and organized for the next one. And that's why, again, it's an internal and regional problem. It's not a border security issue.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you, Assaf Orion. Thank you, Matt Levitt. Thank you, Hanin Ghaddar. And thank you to all of you around the world joining for this policy forum again to learn more about events in the Middle East and U.S. policy. Please look at www.washingtoninstitute.org, the website of the Washington Institute. Thank you and good day.
Thank you.